Well, you see too that often people who are tried by fire discover the deepest association with meaning precisely under those conditions. And that is analogous to the vision of the crucifix, let's say, that you have to go deep into the darkness and perhaps hopefully voluntarily before you can see the brightest of all possible lights. And so this idea that, part of the problem is, if you provide your children with everything, which you could do as a wealthy parent, let's say, you deprive them of deprivation, you deprive them of adventure, you deprive them of destiny, and you remove from them the necessity of grappling in a manner that really does make life meaningful. One of the things that I've really noticed in my tours, this has been extremely interesting and heartening, is that whenever I talk about the nexus between responsibility and meaning, the audiences always go dead silent. They're pretty silent during most of the discussions, but that particularly brings a hush to everyone, because it's not a message that people are receiving anymore. It's like, okay, life is suffering and malevolence in its essence, in some undeniable sense. It may not be only that, but it is undeniably also that. And so you need a sustaining meaning to tide you over while you're suffering and while you're betrayed. And then the question is, well, where's the most reliable place to find that meaning? And one answer is, well, hedonism, and another answer might be cynicism and anarchism and that sort of wild life that goes along with throwing off all constraints. And there's some attraction to that. But more fundamentally, if you watch how people actually respond in times of crisis, they find that the responsibilities that they've undertaken in the past to form friendships, to form intimate relationships, to clean up their family and establish tight bonds, to take on some major burden and make sacrifices in their life, that's where they get all the meaning.
The internal problem is, how do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids, because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do. And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. Let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them, carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid. So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity. So maybe you're a kid in the playground, right, and you're having some trouble with other kids, and in the back of your mind, I should deal with this myself, but you go and tell your mom and get her to intervene. And you know that that's not right. You know that you're breaking the social contract, but it's easier, and so that's what you do. You run off to an authority figure and hide behind the Great Father, right, roughly speaking. Well, the problem with that is you don't learn how to do it yourself. So then you have to relearn it painfully when you're 40. So then you take people out. You say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators. Okay, well, let's look at a picture of an elevator. Let's have you imagine being in an elevator. Let's go out to an elevator and let you watch the terrible jaws of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die, but more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and finally you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before, because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you, because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? No, because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation, because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? Well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think.
Hedonism doesn't work technically. Like, we looked at the effect of positive emotion on decision making. Okay, so to pursue hedonism is to suppress negative emotion, let's say, but also to pursue positive emotion. And those can be technically differentiated neurologically and psychologically, conceptually. They're completely separate systems. They're mutually inhibitory. They run on different biochemical pathways. What happens when you're hedonically, when you're in the midst of a hedonic experience? And the answer is, you get short-term and impulsive. And a lot of the pure operation of the hedonic system is short-term impulsivity. And so the pathology of hedonism, technically, is mania. And it's the counterpart to depression, let's say. And manic people, they want to do everything at once, and they're unbelievably impulsive. And so they can't make good decisions. And you might say, well, if your philosophy is hedonic, then whatever makes you happiest is a good decision. But then you see pathologies of hedonism that produce impulsivity. And the way out of that is to recognize that it's sacrifice that's the right replacement for hedonism. Because you might say, well, I should be self-centered. We talked about this earlier. It's like, well, do you mean the self that is going to drink a quart of vodka tonight and then be hungover tomorrow? Or do you mean the self that's going to sustain itself wisely and carefully over a 40-year period, let's say in a properly sustaining marriage? And so it isn't even hedonism. It's narrow, impulsive, immature, 2-year-old hedonism. And that is not a solution.
This is why there are no convincing movies about heaven, because our hedonism has generated this notion of heaven as supernatural hedonic pleasure. Whether it's the beatific vision or music or golden streets or whatever, we're bored by that. That's not it. We don't know what it is, but that's certainly not what it is. The problem of boredom goes deeper than we think.
Well, in Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky nails this too, because he says, and it's so brilliant, he's criticizing the Palace of Crystal, which was a building built in the UK for the World's Fair, and it was the first modernist building, and it was this image of technological utopia and material plenty, which the Marxists push as well. And Dostoevsky said, well, what's wrong with this materialist utopian vision? And he says it so brilliantly with his bitter and cynical character. He says, if you set up human beings so they had nothing to do but lie around in warm pools of water and busy themselves with the propagation of the race and eat cakes non-stop. So the land of milk and honey in the narrowest possible sense. The first thing that we would do is set about the place, smashing it up, just so something unpredictable could happen so that we would have our adventure. And I read that and I thought, man, that's so deadly right, is that he said human beings are ungrateful and we can curse. It's the primary thing that separates us from animals. And that it's related to the idea of eating the fruit in the garden of paradise, is that we are made for a challenge. We are made for an adventure. We're not made for this kind of narrow and local hedonism. It's demeaning and it's counterproductive. And it isn't rich in the face of tragedy and malevolence. It's a bad solution. Okay, so the first thing is that the probability that you'll be happy because you've accomplished something in any permanent sense is virtually zero. Well, the reason for that isn't what positive emotion is for. Positive emotion is to indicate that you're making progress towards a valued goal.
Yes.
Now
it's the driver, right? Not the finish line.
Exactly. Well, and that's actually pharmacologically separate, right? Because a satiation reward, which would be the accomplishment of something, calms you and stops that program from running. So, for example, once you've become vice president, if that was your goal, then the whole pursuing vice president program comes to a halt. Now, the problem with that is it leaves you without a goal, and it also leaves empty space, which you immediately have to fill. And so often people feel disquiet because now they don't know what to do, and they miss that rush because they're no longer pursuing something. And so it's very important to know that positive emotion is experienced in relationship to a valued goal. And then the question becomes, well, what's the most valuable goal to pursue? And that's really a metaphysical and a theological question. In terms of the mechanics of feeling, so imagine that you're negotiating the structure of a date with your wife and you're developing a shared vision. And so you say, well, on Wednesday nights, once a week, we're going to go for dinner, and maybe you specify the restaurant, and you're going to make the arrangements, and I'm going to get dressed up, and then we're going to go see a movie, and you're going to pick the movie, and then we're going to have a romantic interlude afterwards, and we'll run that and see how it goes. And then what you want to do is you want to picture that, and you want to watch how your body reacts on the emotional level, and that's a bit of honesty. It's right, and you can see, well, if we went to this restaurant, well, I don't really like that restaurant. I think it's kind of expensive. I had a bad time with the waiters. I don't think I'd be happy there. Then you say those things to your partner. You say, well, I'm thinking this through. I'm imagining it. And here's the objections that are coming up. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe I've got this wrong, but I'd like to hear your input because, we want to get this right. Should we reevaluate my feelings about the restaurant, or should we think about a different restaurant? And that should be a question, because you don't know. Maybe you're just stupid about the restaurant, or you're cheap, or you're afraid to go there because you don't have the right clothes. I mean, you don't know, right? But if you want to get your feelings in line, you develop the vision, and then you apprehend the vision with your feelings. It's kind of what you do when you go to a movie and you fall into the fantasy of the character. You embody all the emotions and you evaluate it that way. If you're driven by a vision, that's positive emotion, because approaching something positive in a visionary manner generates positive emotion. If you're only fleeing from things you don't want, then you're constantly in a state of anxiety and depression. That's how it works, because
where did that go? Where did we lose a shared vision? Why can't somebody put a flag in the ground and say, this is where we're headed? That seems to be gone.
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question, I mean, I would say that's the consequence in the most fundamental sense of the death of God in the most fundamental way. It's the death of a sense of higher order unity. Now, it's also a very complicated question. If you ask someone, what do you want? If you could ask your wife that, what do you want? You'll probably freeze her into immobility, because it's really like asking, how do you want all of your life to go? please summarize. And one of the things that, well, it's a lot, you know. And one of the ways that you can deal with that, which you undoubtedly know as someone who's conversant with cognitive behavioral techniques, is you can ask people more micro questions too about what they want. So you might say, well, we did that on the dating front already, right? We talked about that. We talked about how you might think about how you want your meal times to go. We only talked about dinner time, but you could talk about breakfast and lunch as well. And then there are other micro domains that are very crucial that you can also consider. It's like, so you could ask yourself, well, if you could have the education you wanted, what would that look like? If you had the job or career track that would motivate you, just hypothetically, what might that look like? Sketch out a bad plan. If you had some friends, first, do you want some friends? And if so, how many? And if you had friends and the right number, how much time per week would you like to spend with them? And if you had some time outside of work and familial responsibilities, what might you like to do with your time that you would really like to do? And the thing about these questions is that they're real questions. You know, there's this gospel statement that if you knock, the door will open, and that if you ask, you will receive, and if you search, you'll find. If you seek, you'll find. And people who are faithless in some sense think about it as kind of a Hallmark greeting card approach to the world. It's just, well, you just ask for things and they appear. It's like, no, that isn't what any of that means. It means nothing that you want will manifest itself unless you aim for it. And you won't aim for it unless you know what it is, and you won't know what it is unless you ask yourself. And then you might say, well, why don't you ask yourself? And the answer is, well, maybe no one ever explained to you that you needed to, which is a crucial issue. And then maybe you don't also trust yourself. You know, because you might think, well, if I let myself know what I wanted, given my bloody track record, I would do everything I could to screw it up. So I'll just keep myself opaque to myself so that I don't fail at something that's truly important. And then I can always regale with myself with the idea that, well, I didn't succeed, but I didn't really try. Had I really tried, I might have succeeded. Whereas if you let yourself know what you want and then you try, you also set the preconditions for failure. So it's risky.
That's right.
But the alternative is, well, you don't know what you want. So it is a meditative practice. Like, okay, if I could have what I wanted, imagine the world was constituted so that the entire planet wouldn't explode in an apocalypse if I got what I needed and wanted. Yeah, right. It's like, what would that be? So you might say, well, who should I be? And you might think, well, I should be the college president, I should have this car, I should have this house. Those are all very particularized versions of yourself. And the problem with them is that they're concrete and final actualities and not processes. And so here's a good vision that's a high order vision. And I think it's the vision that our whole culture is founded on. I should be the person who genuinely confronts the problems and challenges that confront me in my life. So that's an attitude of active and voluntary engagement, right? I'm going to do
That's an identity, yeah.
Yeah, and it's an identity of process as well. It's like I'm going to be someone who doesn't shy away from the challenges of life. Okay, and then
I'm a guy who confronts it. Yes.
Right. And so that's St. George and the Dragon, and that's a precondition for therapeutic transformation. Because in order for you to improve, you have to identify the problem, the dragon, and you have to be willing to face it voluntarily. And so you say to yourself, I'm going to do what I can to develop the courage to confront the problems in my life voluntarily. That's who I want to be. If you run, then the signal that the story you're acting out is that the thing you're running from is bigger than you and that you have to hide. And that's just a recipe for anxiety. Now, it's not necessarily that easy to turn and face something, but you do detail out a variety of strategies in your books that might help people do that. You can differentiate the problem. Like you might have been traumatized at work, let's say, or let's not use that sort of jargony that jargony phraseology. You may be having tremendous difficulties at work. You might be dealing with people who are tyrannical at work and find it very meaningless. And that's bothering you constantly. It's disturbing your sleep, for example, and it's haunting you. And you tend to try to push it out of your mind when the thoughts come. And partly that's because the thought of getting a new job is so daunting that you can't face it. And one of the ways of recalibrating that is to break down the problem into small and manageable steps. And so, for example, one of the things that you can do if you might have to consider getting a new job because you're unhappy and miserable at work is open up your resume or your CV and look at it, right? So you might not be able to get a new job, but you might be able to open up your resume and look at it. And then having done that, you've sort of cracked the surface, and then maybe you could spend an hour a week for a month updating it, or 10 minutes a day, or 10 minutes every 2 days, something like that. But part of the trick is to take these larger monsters that are frightening enough so you want to run away from them, decide that you're going to face the situation. You lay out, for example, in your book, you ask people a lot of different questions about what they're thinking. And if something is making you anxious and afraid and miserable, it's very useful to write out all the reasons it's making you anxious and miserable, and to ask yourself, what is it you're afraid of? And then to develop a differentiated plan for dealing with those. It might be very disheartening to see at what small scale you have to begin improvements, right? But the truth of the matter is that tends to scale exponentially. Is once you start making improvements, the improvements feed back upon themselves. And so even if you have to start out small, it doesn't take very long before you're on the upward trajectory, and it's not linear. You can fail precipitously, right? But you can also succeed precipitously. Once you get the ball rolling, positive things tend to aggregate together, and you can make a lot of progress even if you start from a pretty damn dismal place. So here's a very useful thing the psychoanalysts learn to do. So imagine you do go to a social occasion and you find as you enter the hall, you're getting nervous and sweaty. Now, if you watch, this is why Carl Jung, for example, believed that we lived through a dream. We lived life through a dream. So, and that's a story. And so what you'll see is that if you feel that nervousness and you attend to it, a little drama will run in your head in images. And it'll be something like, well, I'm going to go in here and no one's going to talk to me. And this will happen in pictures, like a little movie. No one's going to talk to me, and I'm going to end up in the corner, and I'm going to be bored, and I'm going to be sweaty and hot, and it's going to be real uncomfortable. And it's just like this other time when I went to this social occasion and this terrible thing happened, and the whole drama will play out in your head. And then you think, oh, that's the problem. And then, then maybe you have someone to talk to about that fantasy. Or maybe, because now you have the fantasy in front of you and you looked at it, you can think, well, wait a minute. As you said, wait a second. It isn't like that other situation. My friends are here. I can go talk to John. I know him real well. We'll just have a conversation. I can go sit at a table and with one of my friends and spend most of the time there. I can be with my wife. But what'll happen is we get nervous, and that fantasy will make itself manifest, but you don't want to face it, and that's when you rush to a premature solution. You shut it off. Right. Yeah, so what you're doing there is you're failing to allow the anxiety-ridden fantasy to make itself manifest. And you do that because you don't want to know where you're vulnerable, right? And no wonder, like, who the hell wants to know where they're vulnerable? But the answer to that is, well, someone who wants to fix it. Because you're not going to fix it.
I do, yeah, I do, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And now I've come to, I love looking for those vulnerabilities, and I love a good community, and I love the discourse. I love my friends who will point them out and say, hey, here's a blind spot, which is why, again, circling back, it's why we have to have other people in our life. Now, if done in the right spirit, I love, that's the whole scientific process, right? Rejecting the no, like, I wasn't wrong, right? Like, the whole idea is, let's be a little bit less wrong, right? So I think there's something
that's right.
beautiful.
That's the whole idea. That's humility, man, is to be a little bit less wrong. And Jesus, that's
What a-
a pretty
and what
big
a-
deal.
But what a fun way to live. It's such an easier way to live than I have to be right. That is an exhausting grip on your life. It's a choking grip on your life instead of, I want to be a little bit less wrong. And I begin to seek out places where I might be wrong. That's just taking the blade and trying to sharpen it as finely as possible.
I've been embroiled in a lot of conflict, and I really don't like conflict. And I think the reason that I've been embroiled in so much is because I won't delay it. Like if there's an issue at hand, I want to address it right now. And the reason for that isn't that I enjoy it. In fact, I don't enjoy it at all. But what I really don't enjoy is prolonged conflict that never goes anywhere and that never ends.
Yeah.
And so
conflict delayed is conflict amplified, right?
Exactly
It just grows on you. Yes.
Exactly that. And that's one of the oldest stories that people have been telling each other forever, is that ignored things grow in the darkness outside the city until they become monstrous and break down the walls. And so you think, well, I'm afraid of listening, I'm afraid of hearing the problems. And that's fair enough. It's no wonder you're afraid. But you're nowhere near afraid enough of not doing that, because that's a bloody catastrophe. That'll be a bomb that'll go off in 10 years and blow up your marriage. You'll find out that your wife had an affair because, well, for her own reasons and because you didn't pay any attention to her for like 15 years. And then you think, well, I was afraid to pay attention, and yeah, fair enough. But now look where you are. You're in hell, and that's just not an improvement. So, you know, there's problems of various size out there in the world. And the largest problems are the apocalyptic problems that you just described, right? And it isn't even obvious which of those apocalyptic problems are real. But we could say, well, there's always the possibility that large-scale systems will come to a precipitous collapse. And we have to live with that. That's true in our own lives. We could die at any moment. So could the people we love. Like our cultures can fall apart. The apocalyptic terror is always beckoning as a possibility. Okay, now the question is that your problem? Now the answer...
Can you do anything about it,
well,
right?
The answer is your own nervous system will tell you that. Because imagine that imagine you're facing a problem that's so big that it paralyzes you and it turns you into a tyrant. Okay, that's too big a problem for you, obviously. And what you have to do is you have to scale back the problem until you find a dragon that's a size that you're willing to contend with, that you'll actually contend with. And so, you know, maybe you shouldn't be addressing the large-scale political problems of the world because your own house is a bloody catastrophe. And you watch the news and it paralyzes you and turns you into a ranting tyrant, and that means you're not the man for that job. You have to scale back. And maybe if you scale back and practice straightening things up at the local level, which isn't trivial or easy, you get better and better at it, and then you could face larger and larger catastrophes and practically and productively, right? Instead of virtue signaling and going astray. You know, you do this in therapy. Is if someone is having a hard time making friends, you break that down into micro steps. And one thing you might have to do, as we discussed, is you might have to teach the person to introduce themselves. You know, and their problem is, I don't have any friends. It's like, no. Your problem is you don't know how to shake hands and look someone in the eye. Right? And then you might say, well, can you do that? And they might say, well, I'm afraid to shake hands. It's like, well, can you look at me? Can you stretch out your hand? You know, can you touch my hand? I mean, this might sound trivial, but lots of people are paralyzed with social anxiety. And they have no idea how to shake hands. Yeah. And that just stops them cold, right? Because if you can't introduce yourself, how the hell are you going to make friends? It's something like adopting a form of metaphysical courage that's transcendent, right? Because let's say you have to take on the suffering of your own life forthrightly, and to the degree that you're able to do that, you'll be able to maintain your moral compass despite your suffering and maybe work to ameliorate it. And in order to do that, you have to adopt a particular pattern of being. And that pattern of being isn't just unique to you. Like, you have to manifest it in your own life, but the pattern is universal and it's divine and sacred for exactly that reason. And the pattern is something like forthright confrontation with those things that terrify you. So there's a story, this is very cool, and some people have heard me talk about this before, and maybe we can close with this. Here's something that I've been chewing on that's quite the miracle, and I don't know how else to really explain it. So when the Israelites are lost in the desert, they start to become fractious and idol-worshiping. And so they fall prey to ideological possession, fundamentally. They lose faith in the spirit that brought them out of tyranny. And no wonder, because they're in the desert. It's like they're not having a good time. So it's no wonder they get faithless. But what happens when they get faithless is that God sends poisonous snakes in to bite them. And you might think, well, that doesn't reflect very well on God. And that's one of the interesting things about the Bible, is that there are plenty of stories that have that strange paradoxical twist. It doesn't matter. The story really means that just because you're lost doesn't mean there isn't something stupid you can do to make it worse. And faithlessness will certainly make it worse. And so God sends in these poisonous snakes, and the Israelites are getting bitten pretty good. And so they go to Moses and they say, look, we're sorry that we're so faithless and useless and fractious and divided, but the snakes are getting a bit much, so maybe you go have a chat with God and get him to call them off. And so Moses says, okay, and he goes and talks to God, and God says, God's, he's irritated with the Israelites, but he can be bargained with, apparently. And Moses makes the case for the Israelites. He said they've been punished enough. And God, what should happen, or what could happen, is that God just gets rid of the snakes, because he sent them to begin with. He can just chase them away. But that isn't what happens. And this is very strange. And I defy anyone to come up with a simple explanation for this, because it's really something uncanny. So what God tells Moses to do is to make a bronze stake, a staff, which is like the staff of Moses, and it's like the tree of life. That's another way of thinking about it, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. To make a staff out of bronze, and then to cast a serpent in bronze, and to put the serpent on the staff, and then to have the Israelites come and look at the serpent. And if they look at the serpent, then the poison will no longer destroy them. So he doesn't get rid of the poison. He doesn't get rid of the snakes. What he does instead is he gets the Israelites to gaze upon that which poisons them. And the consequence of that is that they'll be strengthened. And that's this. Now, the cool twist on this is that that's what Christ says about himself. Like thousands of years later, he says, unless his image is lifted up the same way the serpent's image was lifted up in the desert, that there's no possibility of redemption. Now, that's a very weird juxtaposition of ideas, right? Because you think, well, what the hell's going on in the desert, and what's up with the bronze snake? That's a mystery in and of itself, which I think is associated with the necessity of facing that which can bite you, right? To pay attention to it, to adopt a stance of challenge in relationship to it. It's a very deep idea. But then to make the case that that's analogous in some sense to the crucifix, that's an unbelievably sophisticated psychological move. Because you might say, well, what's the sum total of all snakes? And I think you can make a very straightforward and compelling psychological case that there's no confrontation that's more ridden with snakes than the confrontation that's laid out in the story of the Passion. It's a limit story. So it takes all possible snakes into account: betrayal, death at the hands of the mob, innocent suffering, like you name it. It's part of the suffering in that story. So it takes that snake and it makes it into a meta snake, and it says, well, it's one thing to look at just a snake and to get braver as a consequence, but you should instead look at the mother of all snakes and get as brave as that could possibly make. And then you think, well, if you're going to cope successfully with your life, with all of its particularized catastrophes, do you really think that you're going to be able to manage that without admitting that the problems are there? Who in the world would ever think that? And so then is it not the case that you have to look at what's darkest in order to be able to contend with it? And then you might say, if that's the spirit that redeems you, in what manner is that not a sacred spirit? If it's the universal pathway to redemption in the face of suffering, which seems to be the case on psychological grounds as far as I can tell, then I don't see how you can claim that that's not real, true, foundational, all of that. I can't see a way out of that strange conundrum. So. think that partly what happens, if you do look very deeply into the suffering that characterizes your life, is that one of the things that will happen is that you will start to understand the role you play in that suffering.
Yeah.
Right? And like life seems to have an arbitrary element, and there's plenty of sick children who don't seem to deserve it morally, let's say. But when you look very hard at your own suffering and you contemplate it, the probability that you're going to see some causal role that you've played is pretty high. And then you have the option then of not doing that anymore. And that's something like confession and redemption. And that's something like also following this divine pattern, right? Is to stop doing those things that are dooming you to unnecessary suffering. And one of the things I've wondered about for a long time is that if you stop doing everything that you could that was off target, even by your own criteria, if you stop doing all of that, how much suffering would be alleviated? Not only for you, right, but for the people around you. And
Most
to answer
of it.
that, well, that's,
not all of it,
well,
but most of it.
Well, yeah, and an indefinite amount of it, right? Because it also seems like that's a sort of struggle without end, is that you can get better and better at it. And you can get more productive, and you can get more generous, and you can get better at staving off suffering, and you can get more helpful to other people and to yourself. And we don't know what the upper end of that is. Let's say we all have to deal with the catastrophe of life, with the pain and limitation of life. And so then you might say, well, how do you do that? How is it even possible to do that? And one answer might be, hide from it, bury your head in the sand. And I'm not being smart about this. It's like, the less you think about your mortal vulnerability, the better off you'll be. It's an insoluble problem. Your best bet is to run away from that realization, to keep yourself blind, and maybe to busy yourself with as much hedonic pleasure as you can possibly manage.
Drown your sorrows.
Well, and that's understandable, right? You could say, okay, well, a case can be made for that. But it's not a very psychologically astute case, because one of the things that psychologists have figured out in the last 100 years is that if you want to stabilize people psychologically, and if you want to imbue them with courage, then what you do is you help them expose themselves voluntarily to the things they're afraid of that they're avoiding. It's a very powerful technique. That's exposure therapy. And what exposure therapy seems to do is to make people braver. And I'll tell you how exposure therapy works, because it's no joke. So I had a client who was afraid that he would cut himself. And he was afraid that if he was on the top of a building, that he would jump off to his death. And one of the exercises we worked out was that he would sit at the top of his building near the edge with a knife.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a very frightening thing to do as a therapist, because he's saying, look, I have this impulse to slash my throat and to jump off a building. And I thought, well, why don't you confront both of those things at the same time? Now, we worked up to that, but I'm just using that as an example to show you how intense that exposure therapy can be. It's like we need to identify what, okay. So then you might think, well, what are people most fundamentally afraid of? And I would say, well, it's something like pain and death. And then even more particularly, it's unjust pain and death. And that's really at the core of the crucifixion image and story, because it's unjust suffering and death. And so the psychological, what would you say? Why have people been compelled to gaze upon this image of unjust suffering? And the answer is something like, the best way to adapt to life is to gaze on the image of unjust suffering, to do that fully. And I think that's true. And there's this strange idea too, and this is a very strange idea, that the spirit that guides the Israelites out of the desert, say in the Exodus story, so the spirit that stands against tyranny and that stands against slavery, is the same spirit that confronts tragic mortality voluntarily, right? There's an equation. That's the equation of the New Testament and the Old Testament. And I also think that's likely true, that the pattern that calls to us from within to object to tyranny and slavery is the same pattern that enables us to have the courage to look upon our own mortality, like forthrightly. And I would say that has to be that way to some degree, because imagine you want to stand up to a tyrant. Well, you could put your life at risk to do that, right? I mean, if you're going to
speak truth to power, to use that terrible cliche, you're going to have to face the fact that you might be hurt and even killed in doing so. And so how can it be different to face the inevitability of your own mortality for a moral cause and stand up to a tyrant? Those have to be the same thing. And so I would say it's time for all of us to learn that these axiomatic presuppositions, like the idea that part of what gives us intrinsic value is the fact that we're reflections of the Word made flesh, that actually turns out to be true.